Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Welcome to live stream. I don't really have a name for the interview segments quite yet, but work in progress. We have some very special guests for this particular interview slash post video analysis. We're having
Hello.
a bit of trouble with Native Lang's audio, but without further ado, there's Atlas Altera here. Welcome.
Hello, hello. Thank you
And
for
I'm just
having
really
me here.
excited. Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here to have this conversation. It's a long time in the making.
I know, yeah. Since our first chinwag.
Yes, yes. That was a non-content chinwag. That was just you and I shooting the breeze.
Exactly.
But it was a great conversation. I was really, really glad to discover your work, and I'm really excited to be able to share it with my audience and get into some of the ideas and meaning behind it.
Well, I'm happy. I'm glad. And the fact that we have Native Lang here, my
Yeah,
goodness. We're both
I mean,
fans, longtime fans,
exactly,
hey?
exactly. We were actually saying, we both saying before we started the stream that we were watching Native Lang before we had our own respective channels.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like one of the first YouTubers that I was passionately following.
Yeah, in my head, Native Lang is like my personal resource. It's up there
Yeah,
with those kind of science YouTubers and educational YouTubers that I grew up watching and learning from.
exactly. Yes. So hopefully Native Lang fixes the mic.
Yeah, but in the meantime, I suppose we could start with, I guess, talking a bit about the diversity video. For those who haven't seen it yet, I recently put out a video on, why diversity matters. And I'm not just speaking about a particular form of diversity, I'm speaking about diversity in really all its forms. Speaking of cultural diversity, biological diversity, cognitive diversity, identity diversity, all these various forms of diversity and the value that they have in really the meaning of life itself. And when I was working on the video, I had reached out to you because I felt like this would be the perfect bridge to
Yeah.
between our particular projects. Oh, it looks like Native Lang is on. Hello. Okay, perhaps not.
Well,
Hold on.
oh, I heard something.
Okay. All right. I'll just give him a little
Now
bit
he's
more
back.
time there.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we can
Yeah.
I heard a voice.
Okay, hopefully this works.
Yes.
Let me hear. You want to say something again? Hello.
Oh, maybe his audio is not working.
Could be. Could be. Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were hearing
Okay.
you for a second,
Oh,
but we're not. Hold on. Okay.
Yeah,
Now he
yeah,
can't
yeah,
hear
it's an audio
us.
thing. Got to hit the settings.
Yeah, see if you could go into the Discord settings and yeah, no worries. Yeah. So I felt like it was a good bridge between our respective projects. Me with the whole project I'm doing here on Androidism and the stuff that you're doing with Atlas Altera.
Right? Yeah. I mean, yeah, and Atlas Altera as a fictional world building project, right?
Yes, yes, it's not an ideal future that you're painting here or an ideal alternative world you're painting. It's simply different from the world that we currently exist in certain ways. And in ways that I
Exactly.
think
Like
highlight
I
aspects of our real world diversity.
exactly. Like I kind of the way I put it is like I tongue in cheek used the word syntopia. Like it's very pompous to coin words and stuff, but the word syntopia meaning that it's neither utopia or dystopia, but just a like look at something that's very familiar, so a world that's very familiar, as flawed and imperfect as our current world is, but like let's just like add a whole new layer of like cultural and linguistic diversity that's not very believable, but what would that look like in our flawed international affairs? What would that look like?
Well, I think we're here in native lang now.
Yeah.
It's very distant though. Hmm. All right. Well, yeah, I think I came across your work maybe on Reddit on r/imaginary maps or something like that. Or I would have
Mm-hmm.
maybe stumbled upon it in YouTube recommendations. One of the two. I think it was either the channel I came across first or the maps I came across first. But I was just like enraptured by it. I felt like all the world building that I had done. I've been doing world building since like I was a child, since I was like 7 or 8 years old. And I felt like all of
Nice.
that was, it pales in comparison to the level of detail that this project has, all the detail and the work that's been put into this project. The
Well,
considerations that you've put for every region, the care that you put in every map, it's something to aspire to. It's something I'm inspired by.
yeah, I mean, thank you. And I got to say, like, since the first few maps that I made, most of it has been done in collaboration with this Italian graphics designer, Zviner, or Matteo Cavallo, who I think is in our chat right now. But also, like, a lot of people, like, I think the reason, like, my proof of concept, my first map that I put out there was actually supposed to be my last map. Actually, my partner, I was doing my masters, and my partner, just before, I think it was during COVID, she was like, "Why don't you just, like, your weird hobby that you do in your spare time? Why don't you just print it and put it online and then just be done with it?" And I remember even telling the local printer and the framer, after doing this work of getting it out printed, I was like, "You'll never see me again. This is a really weird thing that you just saw, and you'll never see me again." And then I guess it kind of like took on a life of its own. And because of that, like I said, people had reached out to me, and I was able to connect with people from all around the world who were like, maybe you want to consider this and you want to consider that, or can I help you translate this? Can I help you transliterate this? Can I help you do research on this? Right? And like it really is a whole community that's come together to help put out all the subsequent content that we've done. Like I've been privileged to work closely with a Nahuatl or Nahuatl speaker. I've been privileged enough to work with people who are in Nuktitut in the Inuktitut linguistic community. So I've like been spread around various Papuan WeChat, or sorry, Papuan message um, group chats, right? Like I've just been weirdly able to attract a lot of people from all kind of walks of life and all kinds of in all corners around the world, and that has been what helped carry this project to where it is at now, right? And the kind of work that you were doing as a hobby, you were probably doing it all on your own, just like I was initially, right? So who knows? Who knows what will happen if you ever publish your work?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I've worked on a lot of different worlds over my lifetime. Some leaning into fantasy, some leaning into the superhero genre, some leaning into solar punk and that kind of thing. Most of it, or I'd say all of it, hasn't really
Nice.
been published. But every time I go through your stuff, I'm like, gosh, I need to pick back up those projects. I think is
Yeah.
really inspiring too. And I think the reason people are drawn to your project and want to participate in it is because of your project's emphasis on highlighting the world's diversity. I'm not surprised that you will get those kinds of contributions from translators because some of the cultures that you mentioned there, some of the languages that you mentioned there, the language speakers you mentioned there, are people that often do not get any consideration at all for their languages.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, like it's an imperfect world, right? So The like oftentimes I actually get a lot of backlash for people who say like it's a it's fetishizing the nation state model. And to be clear, like I don't this is not my ideal world, a nation, like a bunch of nation states like this, ethno nation states to for that matter. But for some reason, I as a kid, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, I learned about the world through maps and through atlases, and almost all maps and
Yeah.
atlases have political boundaries on them, right? And the unit of analysis, though flawed, is usually a political subdivision. Most often is state. And so I know it's an imperfect way of learning about the world, but I was just like turning that kind of concept upside down to do this, and then trying to see how many languages, that's like the main key thing. Like, Altair has a lot of like diversity, but like languages, it's like main thing, like its main variable. And I was like, okay, how many languages can I fit here while balancing world history, major events that would get us to something slightly similar to our world, right? So that it's recognizable. The whole important thing is that it's recognizable. If you want to see
Yeah.
linguistic diversity to the max in terms of like just like where all these languages spread, there's all kinds of resources for that, right? Like Ethnologue has like a GIS element to it, I believe, but there's also like native land and all kinds of like GIS based resources that show you historic and current ranges of indigenous peoples and all kinds of language minorities, right? There's the Endangered Alphabets Project, which has like an atlas element to it where you can look at all the writing systems around the world. There's all kinds of resources like that, but they always seem to be kind of like something, to me, when I show it to people, and even myself, sometimes I catch myself thinking, it's almost always kind of like, oh, that's a nice extra piece to know. It's like a nice aside. It's
Yeah.
never like, I don't know what I mean, like what I'm trying to say here, but I feel like it just, because it's like something that you have to scratch under the surface, it's like going against the grain, or going on, it's an uphill battle for appreciation or to do justice to that kind of diversity. It's like something that people like native lang wouldn't struggle with understanding, because or you or people that we know, because we're really deeply interested in these topics. Like
Yeah.
when someone mentions the word Indonesia to me, all kinds of things are happening in my brain that are beyond just like the main lingua franca spoken there, and the main political system there, and the main dominant religion. I know all the different elements of Indonesia, but I think a lot of people fail to be able to like imagine that. And I think like having these additional resources is really important, but it's like an uphill battle a lot of the times. I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know if I expressed
No,
myself clearly
I
there.
get it. I get it. What I find interesting about it too is, you mentioned that you were using the nation state model not to idealize it, but to represent through maps something of our reality in terms of linguistic diversity. And one of the things that I
Yeah,
talk about in the video, which is kind of an irony, is that the linguistic diversity that exists in the world, one of the major threats to it is the nation state, is the
exactly.
state as a model of assimilation, as a model of constructing a national identity. It tends to suppress and wipe out these languages. And so you've kind of inverted that by using the state as a
100%.
representative of those languages.
100%. And like I think native lang, one of his recent videos was about like coexistence, like multilingualism in like Southwest Africa. And he had a lot of little kind of hints about like what he thought about. And sorry, I don't want to speak for you, so you feel free to jump in, native lang, because I know your mic is
Yeah,
working
I'm
now.
hoping the
Sure. Yeah, everything's working. Thank you for
Nice.
helping me
awesome,
troubleshoot the
awesome.
process. Also, hello everyone. To
Hello.
everyone who has watched my channel before and hasn't, we'll get to that later. I see on the agenda that I'll be able to introduce myself properly to those who don't know me. But
Nice.
yeah, just chiming in there. I think both on your point about Indonesia in specific, and well, I guess I'll tackle those two. Indonesia and Southern Africa, really broadly, they're it's not like anyone's a test case, right? Like
Yeah.
for the nation state model, but in a way, all of these, or that linguistic diversity is the only way to look at human diversity.
Yeah.
which Andrewism covered greatly very well in your recent video. I watched
Thank
it
you.
last night, and I was just, I have to say, not to like glaze you or anything, but I think it's one of my favorites so far. Probably a lot of that has to do with that it like immediately starts to connect with linguistic diversity. So I'm glad that you invited me to this chat. Southern Africa is, in many ways, one of the places that has come up in my videos so far, my animations, and just I should back up one step and say that animation comes from a place of reading and researching, which I mentioned in the video, reading and researching on my own, and realizing that this is something I need to talk about on the channel. And what kind of falls through the cracks, both in terms of the nation state model, but also maybe we want to get into this a little bit, but linguistics as a colonial or colonizing project is and even anthropology sort of more broadly, the ways in which it has been used as a colonizing project, is the concept of translanguaging and transculturing, which is very much central to the arc of that video, because in many ways, Southern Africa is a place that's been heavily colonized on so many levels. But at the same time, it has resisted it. I don't even want to say, a lot of times this is like the colonizing of linguistics is to talk about people as languages, right? We do this sort of like objectification of the it. What is it? It is isiZulu, right? Like that is an it. No, it's people who speak many ways. And part of this project is to say, naming a language is sort of encapsulating people and all of their varied experiences, their words for things, but also the connections between words and the entire taxonomy of how we view our surroundings, food, our relationships. Is something
heuristic.
Yes, is something that really comes to the fore when we think about Southern Africa, and we approach the ways in which people, to use it as a verb, language. In other words, not just thinking of a language as something that I put into a box and name, and therefore I labeled it, I can be done with it. I could say it has these features. Good, end of day. I put it on a page somewhere, I tally the number of speakers. The problem comes in when we say, wait a second, what are people doing with language? What is this process of languaging? Where do we draw those lines and how? Which very much, in a lot of ways, I mean, sorry to say so much, just to sort of reinforce what you've said so far.
No, keep speaking, honestly.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, this very much, this opens up a lot of discussions and a lot of potential other topics that we could bring up. And it is, I don't want to propose this as the way to look at language, because obviously linguistic diversity, it's very valuable to put languages first and foremost and say, well, here is a language I can name. Here are how many speakers. Here are the resources, whatever we want to talk about. But this is another model. It's a more recent model for thinking, we want to say, connecting with something beyond just the named languages and adding that to our concept of named languages, or maybe even going beyond that and talking about something like translanguaging in Southern Africa, or then moving back to Indonesia. What is linguistic diversity like in Indonesia? So in a lot of ways, I think I kind of rushed ahead.
I mean,
there's a lot of conversations to fill in here about what are the features that are interesting about these languages? What are the features that are interesting that people are using now? What kind of loss of linguistic diversity are we concerned about? In some ways, you're welcome, and I'm sorry for bringing this up so early in the discussion. But,
totally fine.
Since you mentioned that video, there's a quick summary of how it might be offer a challenge to the standard model.
To bring a full circle, if I may. So like I was like the point I was trying to reference, there was this translanguaging or translingualism. What's the term again? Is it translanguaging?
I've seen multiple translanguaging. I happen to like. Let's go with that one.
Okay, so basically, that concept, right? I think a lot of people on the most optimistic days want to aspire for a political and social reality for their communities to have multilingual speakers and multilingual functionings in their societies, right? And in my most optimistic days, I believe that even the city I live in, Vancouver, that is happening. Um, uh, and that like we have like 5 generations of Punjabi people in Vancouver that continue to speak Punjabi. We just had Vaisakhi here. Um, and it's but like then I look at like Sayup, the Cantonese dialect or lect, let's say, that is not similar to the Hong Kong or Guangzhou prestige dialect, and that's the language of all the Chinatowns around the world, the historic first language of all the Chinatowns.
I
Um,
was just going to wonder, don't I hear more and more Mandarin or even just standard
exactly,
Chinese like now?
exactly. So they're getting replaced, right? And then in Singapore and Malaysia, they're also making the political decision of like efficiency, right? Like I think Andrew
Mm-hmm.
talked about this, about like monocultures that like were like flat, like the idea of like flattening the world for the sake of efficiency to make better trade deals. Mutual understanding is conflated with this idea too. But
Yeah.
yeah, so like in my more
The idea
cynical
that
days, I see,
the idea that
yeah,
unity must require uniformity.
exactly. That and that it's a false it's like a it's a what do you call it? Oh man, my brain right now, the early morning. It's like a false it's a logical fallacy. So, but my point is that like on our in my most like positive days, I believe that translanguaging can happen and does happen. And in my most cynical days, I see that it's under attack and that there's like like the nation state is so strong, education policies are so strong that you know as as the political normal that we're in right now of the nation state model, where governments kind of choose what is the prestige dialect and in what minority languages to prop up or to just flatten. um, I the prognosis is quite bleak in my most cynical days. I think the prognosis is bleak for a lot of parts of the world. But again, you've also documented that there's so many cases around the world where that's not the case, where on the margins, linguistic diversity can cling on and is clinging on. So in Altera, like to bring a full circle here, with this whole nation state model that I'm showing here, where there's like 1,001 nation states, I'm saying here, okay, so there's 1,001, or I think it's like 1,400. I forget. I never counted, or someone did count for me one time, but I keep forgetting the numbers. But we have like 1,000 plus countries. Each of them have kind of a fetishized the idea of a nation state because that's like how they get onto the map, to so to speak. So that means that they, in on the plus side, we are representing every language family in the world in Altera. Like in this like fake world, somehow miraculously, every language family has one representative on in the political world. Like you have little Iceland's equivalents all around the world where like the state is like propping up a language that a neoliberal might say shouldn't exist. It's inefficient. Why speak Icelandic, right? When you can just speak English and be like plugged into the Anglosphere. So we have 1,001 cases like that. But at the same time, you in those bubbles, they are also doing the damage of the nation state. They are assigning prestige to a particular dialect, and minority languages are clinging on in the margins. Now in Altera, like we can like kind of change the variables a little bit and like tweak the politics a little bit so that there's a lot more minority languages that can cling on and survive. But the state of those minority languages are as good as they would be in our world, if that makes sense. That's like kind of what I'm trying to say is like this model is not perfect, but I just want people to consider that like when they look at this and they go like, oh, like your model that you're showing on these maps, it's flattening the world. And I'm like, yes, of course, the nation state model flattens the world. It creates little microcosms of bubbles of flat linguistic landscapes. But at the same time, as Andrew, you were saying, I've kind of flipped that in a way by saying, but there's 1,000 of them. At least we have 1,000
Yeah.
of them. But yeah, not an ideal world at all. Syntopic world.
Yeah, I'm just kind of zooming through the maps there just to show people the exact level of what we're talking about when we say 1,001 uh, countries representing languages here, especially in New Guinea. I think one of
Yeah.
the points that I wanted to raise earlier was this idea of, trans languaging, right? The idea that, you know, people who speak multiple languages, they're utilizing all of their languages, their full repertoire of dialects and stuff as a way to communicate every aspect of themselves, as I understand the term. And as I get more into linguistics and explore linguistics a bit further, I often think about how I would place myself or position myself as a language speaker, because
Mhm.
I speak on the kind of Creole continuum, right? I speak
Hmm.
in certain spaces and environments closer to the quote unquote standard English, of course, with my accent. And then in more casual settings, in settings where I'm speaking with other Trinidadians, I speak closer to the particular form of the English, Trinidadian English Creole that I grew up speaking and I'm surrounded by. I mean, there are multiple continuums and dialects even within this very small island. And, I would consider myself to be monolingual because, even the Creole is just a variety of English. But then even the idea of categorizing languages in that way, I know it's something that native lang you would kind of quibble with, right? Because the idea of these hard and fast borders between languages to say that, all of these dialects and all of these creoles and stuff all fall under English and therefore I'm an English speaker. It's flawed because while it's categorically neat, it doesn't necessarily get to the reality of the diversity, coming back to that word, um, that we're dealing with here.
Yeah. And ooh, that's such, there's a lot to what you said, even how you said it. The, well, I guess to go back to my notes on your video, and sort of roll this up into an abstraction, because I have two of them, if I may. Can I take a few minutes to
Sure.
opine, I
Go
suppose?
right ahead.
But by all means, jump in with corrections and additions. So one is that, well, I kind of wanted to mention this later. I actually have it on my notes as something like one of the few things I was like, work this in. As you were presenting, Andrew, as you were presenting the ways in which you use your speech, your whatever you want to call them, linguistic capacities. I don't know what the word is. Sure, quibble away. Let's pick the perfect word. But faculties, abilities.
Hmm.
You didn't just mention identities. You mentioned identity in a context,
Yeah.
and that's sort of uh, maybe overly analytical, but that brings out something that is often missing from these discussions of linguistic identity and especially linguistic identity as a proxy for Indigenous identity. Um, so that brings up sort of, I guess it's easy to just pin it on two videos. One is your video about indigeneity from a couple years ago, and
Hmm.
another is the trying to remember her name so I can do her justice in this. Uh, Linda Kikivish. She is a Maya speaker, Spanish speaker, and well, she speaks a Mayan language. I might be wrong that it's Maya proper, whatever term we want to use again, terminology issues. But she has a number of talks that she's given about oppression and oppression in the context of Indigenous peoples, but also in a model of oppression for people broadly speaking, who are sort of not just under the thumb of capital, but under the thumb of empire, state. Um, and this is a relationship that requires those two pieces. It requires identity and a context, because you're not just, a speaker of a minority language, for instance. Um, you are a speaker in this model of translanguaging. You are using your linguistic capacities in a context, like trying to speak something closer to standard English or filling out a form, right? Like that form I take it even in Trinidad, is going to be in a very standardized English.
Yeah.
If you go to a government office, it's not going to show many of the markers that feel very local. So this puts you on a continuum, and we could call it a continuum of identity. But all of those identities have a context where they're, excuse me, where there's an above and a below, and that who is above and who is below can change. But she makes it very clear that that model is going to persist as long as you have this kind of relationship. You have a relationship under power and force and compulsion. And the model is then basically to move between your two definitions you gave in the indigeneity video on defining indigenous people, that one of which involves that that definition of a colonial relationship, and the second of which involves the definition of a connected relationship. And in a way, this model is to push us to look at this very, very concretely and say, under this colonial relationship that still obtains, there's an above and a below. And that is very much manifest in minoritized languages, in the ways in which people use language for power and for gain, and in more subtle ways, in a lot of ways. And if we can move that relationship to that use towards a connected relationship in a way that very much fit with your second definition in that video, she calls that moving to a side-by-side type of model instead. And this above and below to side-by-side sort of vector is, I think, one that's useful for looking at that expression that you just did naturally when you were discussing the ways, or you were mentioning the ways in which you didn't have terms to put to this Creole continuum, or you don't have terms for it. You maybe have too many terms. I find that's often the case.
Yeah, the whole mesolect, basilect kind of conversation.
Yes, yeah, very indeed. You have
and the
the terms,
class
you have the
connotations of those.
And unfortunately, the more you look, at least I've found, the more you
I should probably just explain that to those unfamiliar. This mesolect, basilect, and what's the third term again?
Acrolect.
Acrolect, right. That's like a continuum of Creoles where the basilect is considered the lower class or rural or the non-standard form of the language. The acrolect is considered the prestige variety, the standard variety, the form of, in this case, English that is most internationally recognized and respected. And then the mesolect is kind of the intermediate, it's the in-between, used in everyday interactions, day-to-day speech, and that kind of thing. And so you'll see in the Caribbean, on different islands, even within certain islands in different areas, people will speak slightly differently. There is not one Trinidadian dialect, there's not one Jamaican dialect, Bajan dialect, and so on. There are different ways of speaking even within these countries, and part of that is influenced by geography, part of it is influenced by class, and influenced by educational attainment, and educational attainment in the sense of signaling a certain class and educational position, not so much the actual education of the speaker in question. You know, because people do intentionally speak in their quote-unquote basilect. They speak in their local tongue, in their local dialect, out of a sense of pride, out of a sense of cultural continuity and preservation. And this does not necessarily mean that they can't speak the standard or the quote-unquote higher version of the dialect, but more so that they recognize, consciously or unconsciously, that one way of speaking is not necessarily more or less valid than another, that languages are all the better for their uniqueness and the flavor from speaker to speaker, from community to community, even within this box.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Wait, native lang, before you had a second point, right?
I think I ended up tying them together, But if you
Okay.
want me to drop one more, the one I was trying to tie in was revisiting this sense that we have so far, including your sort of dire pit of your stomach feeling on your worst days, that where is this going? Are we just going to lose it all? Right? Like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not to accuse you of being that dramatic, but like, that's the feeling. That's the feeling
Exactly.
I felt when you were describing it.
Exactly.
So I'm going to put that out there as well when we revisit the concept of diversity itself, I guess, or a definition, or as close as we can get, that we often end up pairing it with extinction and loss. And I think that's interesting. I think that brings up a lot of fodder for discussion, including, like you've mentioned, that very often, I don't know if it's revolutionary optimism or what, but that I often do feel a need to highlight. It's not always something optimistic or positive, but ways in which there are speakers who use language to resist, or ways in which language subverts that very expectation. So yeah. There's the number 2 in the comment there.
Okay. I wanted to actually go. So I know that I don't know if this propels a conversation, but one thing that came to my mind at the beginning of this conversation between you and Andrew, about like Andrew's like linguistic context, is that I have a very similar situation, but it adds a further dimension, which is that in Taiwan, which is the heritage that I bring, there is not technically colonialism, but language imperialism, or how do you know what I'm talking about? It's like the classic France model of republicanism, but Hokkien and Hakka, as well as the Austronesian heartland, linguistic heartland, all of those things coexist in Taiwan. But what is most stunning about it is that at least Hokkien and Hakka speakers very confidently have continued to resist, maybe you could say it, in doing code switching. I forget what you call it, but it's kind of like saying how people sometimes do Chinglish at home. In the diaspora community, they might use that word, which is that Chinese and English actually have grammatically quite similar features, so that you can actually string Chinese words among English sentences. It's the same thing with different Sinic languages or Sino languages. So Hokkien and Hakka are not dialects. No one would really argue that they're dialects, except for people in Taiwan. People in Taiwan will say it's a dialect. Like my grandmother will tell me it's a dialect, and not even a dialect. She uses like the word "tu," which is like countryside, or it has like a negative connotation. It's like rural people. Like each village has like its own dialect, but it's not a literary language, right? During I had an encounter with my uncle one time when he was like telling me, like very in a very heated discussion, that Taiwanese is not a language, right? Or Hokkien is not a language. But and he was saying this in front of his mother, my grandmother, whose native language is Hokkien, who had to learn Mandarin afterwards in her like teens.
So, what would he
and
consider her native language to be then?
it's a dialect, he
If you don't
said,
mind me
and
interjecting.
it was, and it's like she didn't know better is kind of like the logic that they bring to the table, and like she would nod her head. It was so sad to see, and I was even trying to say, and it's very political right now in Taiwan, but there was a language exhibit at a museum that was showing that in the Qing dynasty, so just before the Japanese takeover, the local merchants and local bureaucrats tried to petition the Qing government to allow them to take the imperial examinations in Hokkien. So they wrote in Hokkien. There's only one Sino language that really has flourished with writing its language differently than Mandarin, and that's Cantonese.
Yes.
But in Taiwan, for maybe a brief 50 years, there were people writing documents in Hokkien, but like using Chinese characters the way Japanese, Korean, or Cantonese people use Chinese characters, or Vietnamese people use Chinese characters, to write it in the logic or the grammar of their native tongue, instead of like writing it as if it was classical Chinese. And it was an exhibit on just that. But that was too political for him, and he was furious. And I think half of Taiwan was furious about this exhibit. But
Hmm.
anyway, like this is now like to broaching on the subject of writing, okay? Like, and writing is something that's very important to me too. And I know that writing is something that indigenous scholars and anthropologists and linguists are kind of like, they think it's a very fraught topic. But we could touch on that later. But my only point here is that there were so many judgments and value judgments in, just like you were saying about above and below. And it gets so complicated when it's not even a dialect continuum, when it's like multiple languages that coexist, and translanguaging, but which are doing so in a very, very tense political atmosphere. And everyone in Taiwan thinks that this current context will persist. They think that every new generation of Taiwanese people will be able to joke in Hokkien or Hakka or maybe an indigenous language while speaking Mandarin. That they'll always be able to code switch. But I know for a fact that my cousins are no longer able to do the same thing that their parents and grandparents can do. Um, and it's to do with the stigma, the inherited stigma.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this is just to speak to the whole anecdote that you were talking about in the Caribbean, Andrew, and
Yeah, if you
the
actually don't
above and
mind me
below.
sharing some context there, some further context there as well, because I see a
Yeah.
connection. So Trinidad was colonized by several different parties, right? It was at first a Spanish colony, hence the name Trinidad from the Spanish
Right.
Trinity. And the Spanish did not attract many settlers from Spain to Trinidad because they were more focused on, the rest of Latin America. They did, however, manage to attract a lot of French settlers from other
Mm.
Caribbean islands along with their slaves. So a lot of those French settlers came, and so it was for a long time a Spanish colony with a French speaking population.
Right.
Eventually, well, rather, French Creole speaking population, as the enslaved were the majority. And so eventually it got to a point where, Spain and the UK had a whole war, and with Spain losing, Britain took control of Trinidad and began the process of Anglicization, of imposing the English language onto the Spanish French speaking colony. And within a few generations, we went from yet another Caribbean country with a French Creole of our own, a unique French Creole of our own. We end up being an entirely English speaking country, or rather English Creole country. So there are very few French Creole speakers to this day. Most of them are isolated in one particular community, and most of them are elderly. And part of it is that, the educational system and the political system was imposing the English language. But another aspect of it was that the French Creole speakers themselves
Mm.
were not passing it along to their children at all. They viewed it as many of them viewed it as not necessary for the path to, you know, success, to career success, to educational attainment, all these things. They saw it as an impediment. They saw it as something backwards. So even though they themselves were native speakers of this unique French Creole, they did
Mm-hmm.
not see it as valuable enough to pass it on to the next generation. And that is another aspect of the whole loss of diversity conversation, the language extinction conversation, is that, yeah, in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
cases, we have these minority languages where speakers exist, but these speakers have successive generations after them, but they're not willing
Yeah.
even to pass on those languages. And so there are a few people who are trying to learn our formerly ubiquitous French Creole, and doing language exchanges with our neighboring islands that also manage to maintain their French Creoles despite being under the British rule as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not something that a lot of resources has gone behind. And so for now, really, the French Creole is mainly living on in the shadow of the English Creole, in the sense that a lot of what is in our English Creole comes from that French Creole. The words we may use or the
Right.
ways we may structure saying certain things.
It's like a haunting, right? And that's what, like, when in your video you talked about extinction at the very end, and like what will disappear. And the thought that I came to my mind was that most cultural artifacts that we as a species kind of innovate, they don't necessarily go completely extinct. They leave traces behind. That's the like silver lining to a lot of these things. That a language isolate from 100,000 years ago will leave like a few lexicon in a couple languages that we currently speak today, and that linguists will be baffled about. That's like one kind of silver lining to think about it that way. That there is like kind of passing down, but it's not as deliberate as what we would want in the ideal scenario, right? Which is like a kind of a continuous chain of passing down, a deliberate passing down. And what you were talking about there, just there, about like them seeing it as a hurdle. And Native Lang, feel free to jump in on this, but the thought that came to my mind was actually I had a conversation with Tim Brooks from Endangered Alphabets, and I was just kind of like going like, hey, how do we defend ourselves from naysayers about like our efforts and like what we hope to achieve, right? Like I have a very hard time with not the accusation, sorry, but the argument that I guess like most good intentioned people, well intentioned people have, who just want efficiency. They go like, it's a hurdle for my kids to learn my grandparents' or my parents' language. It's a hurdle for them. It's easier if they just learn English and participate in the global economy, right? And the question that should be asked, I think, which is what Tim said, is not not about like what is the value of there in having this language or passing down this diversity. The question should be, what right does a state or those in power have to erase generations of knowledge and aesthetics, right?
Yeah.
What right do they have to destroy or extinguish another's language or cultural form? That should be the question we ask. It's a simple negative rights kind of paradigm to think about it that way. But if you do actually try to think of it that way, you will realize that before, and this actually goes with your talk on progress with your previous live stream, it's actually, I think, after the Enlightenment, Enlightenment has given us a lot of cool things, humanism and all that, but like the idea of progress has actually given people like a license to erase in a very
Yeah.
kind of a scale that we have not seen, for in most of recorded history, right? Like people historically, when they learn a trade language, they don't need to change their base core. They don't need to go like, I have to learn um, this language to do business with my neighbors, and therefore I also need to be exactly like my neighbors. Historically, that has happened, yeah, and it has happened in slow and fast ways, but it's not
Yeah.
been like the status quo. But nowadays, it's almost perceived that you need to change your core to be able to
Yeah.
participate
Let
in
go of who you are
intercultural
to.
exchange.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I think if the state just did nothing, if the state or those in power, running the show, if they, and okay, it sounds very kind of, uh, sounds very simplistic to talk about it that way, but I'm just saying, if those in power did nothing, did not pass stigma on languages or cultural diversity or marginal languages and marginal kind of cultural aspects, if they didn't pass any judgment on these things in a negative way, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be losing 50% of all the languages in the world in the next generation. That's the projected kind of stat. And native lang might have something more positive to say about that. But like people are constantly saying, we are at risk of losing half of the 7,000 plus languages that we have in the world. If governments were not passing judgment, if they were not inheriting historical stigma, I believe that the erasure rate would be way slower than what we're currently seeing.
Yeah. Slower for sure, because there are governments that are actively stamping out certain languages, making them restricted, not able to be spoken in certain areas, in classrooms, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
So it is it is something that we will probably see slow, though I'm not sure it will necessarily completely not exist, even if there was not that
Hmm.
active suppression. Because on a systemic level, the way that globalization has unfolded, the sort of expectations we've developed around what it means to live a good life, what it means to rise above your station, a lot of it is tied to
Hmm.
aspiration towards the imperial core, aspiration towards the countries and related to those the cultures and related to those the languages that have concentrated the most prestige, that have the most resources to be able to project the most influence. So even if there's not an active effort to suppress, minority languages, indigenous languages, just by the nature of the ubiquity of, for example, American media, Hollywood, ubiquity of, well, there are a lot of other cultural industries picking up around the world, Bollywood, etc., etc. We see that those with the most control of the media are able to exercise a lot of influence over what people aspire to, what people consider valuable. And I mean, that kind of gets into the conversation about representation. What is not
Mm-hmm.
considered valuable because it is left out of that representation.
Mm-hmm.
What something I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to bring up in the conversation of the when I was talking about the Caribbean that I didn't get to mention before, because I didn't remember, was Curacao. Because I think I would have visited Curacao recently, and Curacao was an interesting example to me of trans languaging to the max, it seems. Because all the people that I would have spoken to and interacted with in Curacao spoke at minimum two languages, and some spoke as many as four languages or
Awesome.
five, right? Because you have people who, they speak the local language, Papiamento, which
Mm-hmm.
is a really cool language in its own right. And
Yeah,
you also have
it
people who
is.
Yeah.
speak English, you have people who speak Spanish, you have people who speak Dutch because, they're part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And so
Yeah.
they have the way that they engage with their languages, that they don't, at least the people I interacted with, and I'm not fully familiar with their education system and their local politics surrounding language, but it seems to me that the way that they engage with their languages is a lot healthier, a lot more balanced than the way that I've seen other people engage with their languages, because they have not discarded their Papiamento, their Creole. They have not bowed to the Dutch language as their principal way of communicating. They've taken a more balanced approach. And I'm hoping I'm not idealizing it out of ignorance, but seeing the ways, and I'm sure there are issues with accessibility and that kind of thing, but seeing the ways that Venezuelan migrants have been able to go to Curacao and get involved in their society a bit more easily because that language is spoken so freely there. The way that English speakers are able to interact, the way that Dutch speakers are able to interact, it is indicative to me of a way that language could have been approached throughout the Caribbean that wasn't.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Australia historically has been studied for this situation that you're describing too. Um,
Really?
I'd
like,
add that
yeah.
if anyone out there who's listening has not seen or heard Papiamento before, I encourage you to look it up. Speakers are very proud and happy with their language and very willing to share lessons on YouTube. It's very easy to find approachable material, and it's a very cool language. I will
Very cool. Yeah.
second that.
Yeah. I recently watched, and not related, but another language that kind of similar genesis, Garifuna,
Mm.
or
Yes.
I watched a language on how to make traditional cassava beer, like on Facebook, because I was like researching historic kind of boozes in that part of the world, and the whole thing was described in Garifuna, so I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, but what I was gonna say is like, yeah, Northern Australia, it's documented that there are communities, and native language. I could be wrong, so please correct me if you know the answer. But I think it was like they were saying like it was very normal for kids to grow up speaking 8 languages, right? Was it something like
Wow.
that? Do you remember it? To
I
study?
don't remember an exact figure, but I'm not surprised at least formerly high linguistic diversity that is
Yeah.
increasingly challenged throughout Northern Australia.
And it wasn't even just like the linguistic diversity, but like the point of the academic article, I think that they were studying an island actually, which was just that like,
Ah, okay. Mhm.
yeah, was it, do you remember now? But anyway, so I think it was
No.
just that the status quo, like the logic for the community there, the communities there, was that it's normal language, uh, uh like having being multilingual, being almost a polyglot, was just a default way of living. Um, and I don't know. I don't really. It was a long time ago since I read that article.
Yeah, I
But
can't remember exactly, but um, the Torres Strait Islands are sort of notorious for, to use sort of a negative word, I should say famous for having both high multilingualism and being the only area where you can find both Papuan and Australian languages.
yeah,
Those are
yeah,
usually grouped as sort of these broad linguistic areas. And,
right,
a Papuan language is very different from an Australian language, featurally and historically. But
right.
this is an area where that statement is not true.
Yeah. Um, well, I don't even remember what we were, what was the direction of this conversation. I just had to throw in that little point.
No, I mean it's valuable. I appreciate the kind of wandering approach you take.
Andrew, can we swap the map for the language map? Is it
Sure,
easy for you to
sure,
swap
yeah. Could show people the
just for something new to look at?
yeah,
Maybe even
yeah,
like
yeah,
zoom in on Papua and
polyglotta.
Australia.
We can see the level of detail here, and the coloration is all the different language families, right?
Yes, yes. Are you? Yeah.
And you haven't invented any languages in this project, right? These are all existing languages.
Well, okay. So let's see. There are a couple of holdovers. So I started this project when I was 16. There are a couple holdovers in that there's Esperanto, which is a conlang.
Right.
And there's a couple hypothetical Creoles, let's say. So, you know, as projects evolve, you start fetishizing the data, and so I can see this as a point of critique, right? So the goal of the project was to represent the maybe some people say there's under 200 language families. I think maybe there might be 300 or something, but I'm just saying there was an effort to try to represent literally every living or resurging or revivable language family, a language from every language family or language isolate. Okay, and sometimes it was incredibly hard to do that. Trying to balance the lore, the historical and political considerations. So sometimes we invented Creoles. And actually, like Native Lang and I have been talking about Creoles a lot. The whole Creole language debate. But that was like kind of like you can call it a motif or like a literary device, like kind of like a signature of this project that we did is like we sometimes just like and okay, but the other thing is that to recognize is that there's a lot of alternate geography in this.
Oh,
If I could
yes.
redo it, if I could redo it again, there would be no alternate geography. Again, I
Really,
started
I,
this
I
when I was
like I
16
like the
and just kind of
Australia
built
down
off of
here.
it.
It's kind of cool.
Okay. But anyway, my point is like, with that, I plot a couple islands off the coast, and then I go like, okay, this area, plug in 4 languages here that it's hard to kind of like fit them in onto the map. And when I start talking about like this, it sounds kind of weird, and it's like a god effect, but like you got to remember this is like a fictional project. um but anyway, so I hypothesize Creoles of like 4 languages, for example. So a lot of like one kind of like tongue-in-cheek thing we did is we made a reference to the fact that the Basques kind of were like very oddly they went around quite a big swath of the Atlantic Ocean. They ended up in not only Iceland but Newfoundland, as well as like Brazil, right? And so we're like, okay, so what if, and Basque is like a famous language isolate that a lot of Europeans have a lot of could be healthy or unhealthy interest in. So we just kind of like played with that idea of that, like, okay, what if Basque fishing communities found themselves around all these parts of the world, and then somehow came into contact with these other language isolates that are very hard for us to represent because of the lore, and so we created
Yeah.
Creoles out of that.
But I
Just a
actually, as you
just
make that
artistic
point,
flourish.
by the way, regarding these Basque communities, fisher folk settling in other
Yeah.
areas, we had this conversation the first time we spoke about this idea of non-colonial forms of cultural contact and the ways that you try to represent that in this project. Not to
Right.
say that you have not represented colonial relationships; these are certainly present in the project as well. But
100%.
you have made an effort to explore the ways that communities have interacted historically and in this alternate history that do not require domination and subordination. They don't require that kind of exploitative relationship that we see all too often in our history. Because there are other ways that people
Right.
have interacted.
Yeah. And one of the, and so, it's not everyone's cup of tea, right? So to do justice to the fact that humans have a very dark side, and to kind of like show a reflection of that in a fictional world building project, there are losers all over this map. If we want to simplistically say that people lose in history all the time. Um, in Altera, the idea was to just say, how can we make each of the losers lose less and each of the winners win less? And if you do it that way, you start seeing that you can actually fit a lot more onto the map. Just like having that like very simple kind of mantra that you go by with the creative decisions that we did. Um, so like you're over Mesoamerica right now. What if the contact in Mesoamerica the was and I'm not saying any kind of, I'm not trying to say colonization or imperialism is good, but I'm just saying if we're trying to reflect like a historical thread, that, and it's not bound to happen. It can it could have happened in many ways, but let's say it happened in a similar fashion. What is another model that would have allowed for a lot more linguistic diversity? And the really cool thing that I found out was that when I was reading it, Mesoamerican history, was that the Spanish arrived with crossbows and iron and like steel plates and steel helmets. Still, they were kind of at the end of, like, it wasn't like the way that you think of colonization in textbooks when you think about other European colonial endeavors. They were arriving with pretty kind of low tech parity, right? Disease did a lot of the damage, but
Disease and alliance with other native groups.
yes, exactly, alliances with the is it Tlaxcalas.
I
I
can't
forget
help
the
you
name.
there.
Yes, but
Tlaxcala. Yeah, yeah.
there you go, there you go. But like, what if it actually exists kind of the way that, first of all, what if the indigenous people had a way to resist the disease a lot more? And in Altera we have multiple historical contact periods that predate the Spanish arriving in Mesoamerica. That's like one of the implausible ways that we explain it. But the other thing is that we saw that before this whole like kind of 1800s kind of stamping down of cultures and peoples through colonial endeavors, um, a lot of empire building was just about pure extraction. And one idea that we had was that, oh, look, let's just look at how India kind of kind of sustained successive waves of empire from northwest of the continent, right? And that's how the idea, like, we kind of like use that idea of like the Spanish coming in as if they were like the Mughals maybe, and what would happen if their empire finally crumbled. There would be this kind of Creole and mestizo culture in some parts of the empire, but a lot of the indigenous communities might be able to stay intact, which they have to this day. What is fascinating to know is actually that Mexican nationalism in the 1800s is kind of actually the downfall of Nahuatl. You could go to the courts speaking Nahuatl prior to that, and indigenous communities in the kind of the denser areas of indigenous communities in like the southern and central parts of Mexico, they still live to this day because of some of the logic that I was speaking to, that you don't really talk. That's not like kind of emphasized in the textbooks of how Spanish colonization happened in the Spanish Main. Anyway, so
Yeah.
that's just a little rambling. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's it. That in particular is a very, I mean, I don't want to rip that open because I'll urge us to spend the rest of our time talking about Mesoamerican languages and scripts, and I will be the happier for it. But really, one thing that is, I mean, to add to that, one thing that's kind of not in the textbooks, or it's not emphasized at least, is the the utility of documents written in the indigenous scripts of Mesoamerica throughout that time, because they were also admissible in the Spanish courts. And we know this from a bunch of records on multiple languages and documents from multiple cultures. So I profiled this in a video on the Mixtec script, or sorry, getting the pronunciation wrong, Newzawi, which is sort of like a broad cultural continuum throughout Oaxaca. And the writing system there is, the traditional writing system is incredibly similar in a lot of ways, and probably antecedent to the Nawa script. And because of that, some would even suggest that's sort of where the Aztecs got their way of writing. And this, their documents included a lot of lineage histories, many of which are, I mean, they're beautiful to look at. You can see fully scanned versions in various places online. Some are in Wikimedia Commons, page after page of what might look to be pictorial, sort of just pictures, right? Rows of pictures. But they're very clearly written documentation of people and history and power relationships. And in particular with these communities, with the Nyu, it's a way of retelling connections along lines for trade, for goods, but not goods necessarily to sustain, life, food, more goods to sustain a relationship for the relationship's sake. I think one of the quotes I came across researching for that was, "Trade was for feathers, not for feed." In other words, it was very much that these documents tie into a way of defining community relationships throughout this region. And because of that, and because of their utility and persistence, they weren't subjected to the fires as much as, for instance, famously, the Maya codices were. For a number of reasons, but one was because there was less suspicion about, the religious waywardness of these documents. And I think that ties in beautifully to your story, to your account there.
Yeah. The other thing that, like, if now you talk about, like, what is recognized as writing or not, that just like reminds me of I have a friend Olish from in Poland. I actually hope to send this video to him one day. But he kind of is, he's a hilarious academic in that he's always trying to expand the definition of writing. And he's like, this is writing, this is writing, this is writing. And all his peers are like, oh my God, not you again. But like, if you just recall, like, so long, like, not even so long ago, Kipu, the knots, the strings of knots in the Andes was not regarded as writing, right? But we know that just like everyone who's obsessed with taxation and keeping counts of goods, when you invent something for that, it usually is writing. And so Kipu, the Kipu knots in the Andes is a fascinating idea, a fascinating expression or manifestation of writing that is now really getting a lot of attention around the world. I was recently in Berlin, and the Humboldt, I forget what they call it. It's basically a museum. It's called the Humboldt Center or something. First of all, I was blown away because they had a giant section on Micronesian ships, life size. And I was also blown away with the fact that they curated everything where it was partnerships and collaborations with every group that they were trying to show. So the Micronesian exhibit had commissioned works, commissioned ships designed. And in a lot of their exhibits, like, let's say in like West Africa, Cameroon, Nigeria, the Pacific Northwest, it was about repatriation projects, and commissioning artists from those areas to come. One of the most famous Haida manga artists, not known very well in Canada, is well known in Berlin for helping design the exhibit. So it was like an exhibit that's designed interspersed with contemporary art or contemporary aesthetic interventions, right? Anyway, they had the most amazing exhibit on Kipu. So I'm just saying, like, actually, no, I'm just rambling now. I'm just talking about the fact that, like, compared to other museums around the world, they were doing it really well. But
That
yeah,
sounds
like,
really cool.
things are changing, evolving. Like, hopefully, Aztec writing, Mixtec writing, all these other kinds of forms of writing other than Mayan glyphs, Mayan writing, will
Yeah.
see
We'll see more
interest,
attention.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm reminded of there's a Substack publication that I follow called African History Extra. And if I remember correctly, they have an article on the various scripts that would have been developed in Africa that really receive little to no attention, but are all quite fascinating. And I'm glad you mentioned the sort of less attended to scripts and writing systems because it reminded me of the less attended to forms of language that you also represent in the Atlas Altera project. I mean, I was just zooming in on the part where you had all these different sign languages represented in the work. You know, mind speaking a bit more about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. I mean, so okay, so in terms of writing, I mean, sign language writing is a totally different thing. But I don't know if you have the map on, but what I have is I so okay, to unpack it, the
Well, I didn't mean to conflict
the
the two, by the way. I was just saying, like,
okay, yeah. No, no, I understand though. But I think okay, so I think what you
Are
saw
you
with
talking about like Sutton's sign system, that kind of written system for encoding sign languages?
yeah, I think that's
on
what
Okay.
Andrew was
no,
talking
I
about, right?
was meaning more so. I was just talking about the fact that we have these writing systems that receive less attention compared to
Mm,
the more well-known, you know, Latin, Cyrillic, that kind of thing.
understood. Yes.
And then you also have just forms of language in general that don't receive as
Okay,
much
yeah,
attention. You know, so we speak about
exactly.
language as if it's only spoken language, when sign languages are just as much a realm of linguistic diversity.
Exactly. Okay. So I can't talk about the writing part to the notation that I use, but okay, I'll go with the what you're trying to say here, which is and a fun fact, and native lang, you could always throw way more fun facts about this kind of stuff. But one thing that's always funny to note is that American Sign Language is more intelligible to French Sign Language speakers, I believe, because they have
Yeah.
they shared origins, but not British Sign Language, right? So every community sign language is a language of its own. There's also one of the only cases of language genesis that was ever recorded, like, you know, people watching a community form a language, was, I believe, Nicaraguan Sign Language. And
Yes, I heard
again,
about this.
okay, and there's an amazing board game or card game that was created out of this. So I do maybe someone can find it and link it on in the chat. But I remember buying that game just because I thought it was so cool. It's like a role playing game where you like kind of basically use the logic that the kids in that community used to create their form of sign language. But anyway, so yeah, there's all kinds of sign languages around the world, and one really fascinating thing that stood out to me when I was reading about and I'll maybe I'll give a little backstory. So like when I started Atlas Altera, before it was even Atlas Altera, I started it kind of like the way that a lot of history and geography enthusiasts would have, which is uncritically and having a lot of assumptions that were toxic or unhelpful or just like learned from a colonial textbook kind of standpoint, right?
Hmm.
One of the things that I had, you know, my blinders on, or like, you know, sorry, lack of a better word, I kind of always overlooked was like how language contact and systems worked in the indigenous worlds of North America, and it took a lot of unlearning. But one of the like the aha moments for me there was when I compared what I was reading with what I knew to be in the Sinosphere, in the eastern part of the world, where Chinese is or classical Chinese, the written form is used translingually among people who speak not even different dialects but different language families and isolates. So Korean, Japanese, Chinese people historically, like my dad was doing a huge research project about a Korean scholar, or sorry, a Korean bureaucrat who took the imperial exam in Chinese and governed Yangzhou, which is a prefecture in the lower Yangtze Delta, which is where my family hails from. But one of our governors was Korean, and he probably did a lot of the governing through writing, right? Writing decrees and all that. But you know, maybe he could have spoke Chinese. I'm just assuming here. But the written form of classical Chinese was used across a huge linguistically diverse area. Now, what I found in North America was that there were at least 4 translingual sign languages that function in the same way. So there's one in the plateau, one in the prairies, and they believe also the woodlands, the northeast woodlands had one as well. I forget. Like you'll have to pull up a map of that one day. But anyway, the one that really survives to this day that like most people emphasize is Plains Sign Language, and this was the context where you could have people who speak different languages sit together and they speak their respective language while signing. Or they don't even
Have you
have to
seen
speak
Twin
like
Rabbit's
orally.
video on this?
Yeah, there's a video on Wikipedia on this. But yeah, you can speak your own language while signing something that is different and that
Yeah.
everyone else understands, right? Or you don't even need to speak. Everyone could just sign it. And that was an aha moment for me because I had a similar understanding of how language can work in the written form, in
Yeah.
you know, let's in my neck of the woods, let's say, for lack of better words.
I noticed you
The
have
And so,
this thing
visual
called
modality.
InterSign as one of the
sorry,
languages. Is that meant to represent that? InterSign in the
exactly. So
project.
intersign. Uh, so yeah, I don't want to get too deep into the lore of Altera for people who are not interested in the lore, but like Altera has a United Nations equivalent. It's called the Society of Nations. It's not perfect. It's not better. Okay, it might be a little bit better than our current situation in our world, but one of the cool things about it is that the only world language that is recognized, that is kind of emphasized in this governance, in this like international organization structure, is something called intersign, which is based off of plain sign. So it's plain sign plus as many other invented signs or of words that people needed to for bureaucracy, let's say.
That's really
So
cool.
so that's yeah, that's the fun little tidbit there. And yeah, and then like in the scripts, the writing systems graphic that I made, I represent sign language with something I call haptic. But it's basically, I think it's called Bremen or Hamburg notation or something, which is like an outdated, or maybe not outdated, but just like one attempt at transcribing how sign language um, works for maybe non-sign speakers, like people who want to read it to learn how to sign. And anyway, so that's just an aside.
No, I appreciate that. I was actually looking to see if I could pull up the writing systems on your website so I could show on
I could
screen.
drop it on the Google Drive if you want.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Actually, I
While
think
I
I
do
found it.
that, you found it. Okay.
Yeah, let me just download it real quick.
Okay, and native language. I think I cut
Hmm.
you off, or
Oh, I don't recall if I was chiming in for anything big.
okay.
I guess I'd just in my mind, I'm thinking through my own experience with ASL mostly. Uh, so in my family, we have a history of hearing loss, and when I was pretty much a wee baby, I was introduced to very basic ASL, and then over the years, as I was growing up, sort of reinforced. Um, but going back to learn it more in earnest now, especially as my mother is very advanced in her hearing loss, and I'm signing with her when I have the chance. Um, it's there are just so many things about it that are amazing to me, and I would say, that obviously makes my mind wander to read more about signed languages around the world, both in terms of like understanding the different sign language families and village signs and home sign, and the structural sort of components, both obviously comparing spoken languages, which even though that's not the best way to do this, there's this sort of spoken language bias that's constantly called out. But it's something that like I still can't help but do. It's like, oh, I notice these patterns when I'm encountering sign languages, and I notice these other patterns in spoken languages. Um, One that comes up when I'm watching, like, I'll second that from what I understand, like when somebody is signing in British Sign, is it BSL? British Sign? No, that's Indian.
I don't know.
Black
Yeah.
Sign, it might have a different name. Um, it's very incomprehensible to me except that there's something about the visual modality where there's some degree of iconicity is sort of the fancy term for it, but like the fact that we do represent more, um, I don't know quite what's the way to put it. Just like in spoken language, we have more onomatopoeia and we have
Mm-hmm.
more ideophones, sort of words that, and this will vary between languages. Like Korean is very well known for using ideophones, even when in English you would have a full lexical term. Well, in Korea, it's going to be an ideophone and a verb. So I can't think of one off the top of my head, but there are plenty. And very often they're sort of reduplicated. It'll be like a sound that you say twice or a feeling. It doesn't have to be always a sound. It could be the feeling of a visual thing striking you. And then you'll say hada, right? To do. So hail, whatever the sound is or whatever that feeling is. And in the dare say best or correct translation into English is just going to be a normal word. It's not an ideophone. It's not some like kind of onomatopoeia or what would seem like a poetic term. And in sign language, the analog to that is um, is typically these highly iconic signs. Now they get lexicalized just the same way,
Mm-hmm.
where you might have something that looks like somebody opening a book for having to do with reading. Or in ASL, studying very much looks like you have a book or piece of paper and you're pulling knowledge out of that into your head. But it's not that you think when you're signing, oh, I'm gesturing this concept. It's just a lexical, it's a word,
Right.
it's encoded linguistically. And many of those systems, what they try and capture is not what you might think when you come across the sign language. Well, first, there are two things. One is the iconicity, the other is manual alphabets, which are kind of a separate system that gets incorporated. It's a way of rendering, because signers are very often, well, typically in contact with and by default they are translanguaging, which
Mm-hmm.
means that within a signed system you want to have a way for representing this other language you also know. So for
Right.
ASL speakers, it's often English,
Right.
which means you're incorporating and borrowing English words into ASL. And very often that process isn't as straightforward as it seems.
Uh,
Um, if you want to, you can finger spell a word,
yeah.
and that is it's typically going to be very fast and it looks much more like I'll make an analogy to cursive. If you watch someone who is a native signer, they're going to th- spell it so fast that it looks like a blur of a sign to you,
Mm-hmm.
but they're finger spelling. And then the other way is through iconicity, where we think of, oh, okay, it's going to have some visual form I can recognize,
Right.
which, by the way, is very often not the case. Like, good luck figuring out every, like a lot of times you need as much of a story as you do for a Chinese character.
Yeah.
Um, but the visual modality does allow for a lot of these kinds of differences that
Mm-hmm.
are very interesting. And the writing systems I've seen that aren't just like very much an analog of representing the hands, which is very often, as long as I can kind of turn it in my mind, the easiest one to follow is when somebody just shows sort of the sketch of hands doing a sign. Okay. um, but I
Yeah.
believe the system you mentioned, and
Genetic.
certainly even more abstractly like the Sutton's sign writing, I think it's called, it's attempting to actually break down the components, kind of like
Yeah.
languages have phonemes, break down the shapes and movements in the
Yeah.
sign space that allow you to actually talk about or represent visually what's happening in sign languages. um, Kind of mappable, like not exactly like, but more like what an alphabet would do, or at least like a syllabary would do with the spoken language.
Right. Um, yeah, and it's imperfect. But actually, okay. So what you just said, what you just this, what you just kind of tried to describe to us, or I for sure am not. I don't know sign language. So for people who don't know sign language, what you just described is the perfect kind of, I think, anecdote for, or like analogy that I would use to something that I had thought about when watching Andrew's video the other day. So a question like I had mentioned earlier already, something that I'm constantly trying to battle with, or not battle with, but like trying to address or confront is like why does my interest or why does my project or why do just like like why do these things matter, right? Like why do language and cultural dimensions, why does like this cultural X dimension deserve to live or not go extinct? And I already kind of talked about that, but one of the other points that I had written down in my notes really refers to what you were talking about just right here, which is, even if we were able to, let's just the hypothetical, even if we were able to, as like neoliberal capitalists might want to, captains of industry and like tech bros might want to sell us this idea that even if we were able to download and completely translate everything that we've inherited from all cultures around the world, like the sum of all human knowledge and the communication of all information becomes available to us in English. It's in a monolingual plane. Even if we were able to do that and we were able to reap the neoliberal benefits of the efficiency in making trade deals and attracting resources and traditional technology, wisdom, practices, knowledges, all of these are available to us now. We still have to reconcile the fact that we lose aesthetic diversity, something that like you can't really describe and you can't put your pin on, but that's exactly what you're talking about. You're trying to tell us about the beauty of how that only someone who speaks sign, who knows sign language, would be able to appreciate, and then they're trying to explain it to us in and it is wonderful to understand that through what you just explained, and we appreciate it. But once that's gone, it's kind of hard. You don't know it exists. Once it's as if like if you didn't tell me this never existed for me, right? And so these kind of other cultural forms, aesthetic diversity, that I for lack of better words, that I'm trying to get to is like it's the same thing as like trying to tell someone who why poetry in another language is important. Like translators and lyricists know that one language form is irreplaceable for another, right? Like just because haikus are 3 syllables, 5 syllables, three, you know what I mean? You're like the English people, we know what a haiku is. The haiku in a Japanese form is still different, and it's irreplaceable. You know what I mean? Like so, basically, what you just described is kind of goes to what that thought that I had when I watched Andrew's video. Again, rambling. I'm sorry, but
So we're here for.
I just thought I needed to say that.
Yeah,
I think
really...
there's oh sorry.
Go ahead.
I'll insert real quick. The thought that comes to my mind is I don't remember her name. A Hawaiian studies researcher who wrote a paper on the language proficiency scales, the most common one that I've seen used, that goes A1, A2 up to C1, C2, and her paper is about creating an indigenous proficiency scale, a model called, I've seen it, I think, used by UH Hilo, Ana Olelo. Like it's like a different model for the language. Olelo means language in Hawaiian, and it's used to evaluate speakers both in terms of a more appropriate model for Polynesia and specifically Hawaii, but also for heritage users of the language who come from a culture where they already understand the terminology, the plant life, the cultural rituals, the songs, the mele chants, but need the specifics of, okay, here's how verbs work, and you put particles here, and there's o versus a possession in Hawaiian, and you have to deal with these things. So I think that's an interesting mention that ties into that way of seeing or way of appreciating.
Exactly. There's so many examples of this, right?
I appreciate that show.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate both of you coming on to this stream. Honestly, this conversation could go on forever, on stream, off stream.
And
I'm glad it was able to happen. What's that?
I said, and may it go on forever.
Yes. Yes. But I think we're coming up on the time there. So I'm going to put a little poll in the chat if people are up for seeing you guys return, and if you guys want to return for a future conversation, because there are other aspects of Atlas Altera's project that we could have gotten into. You know, there's things like the variety in drinking culture between societies, the approach you've taken to representing time zones. I honestly have a bunch of questions I want to ask about your religion map, which kind of ties into the
Mm-hmm.
conversation I had about religion in my one of my previous videos. And as with any kind of project that is meant to represent an alternative Earth, I have a bunch of questions about my neck of the woods, being the Caribbean, and some of the thought process you had in discussing that, and in coming up with that rather. And as for native lang, I mean, I have so much to ask about where you see the state of linguistics as a school of thought, as an approach, as a science, how you have been getting involved in various linguistic practices, how you learn languages. I know you mentioned that you're learning sign language, but I'm curious about what other languages you may speak or be involved with, and what your thoughts are on that process as somebody who's been trying to learn Spanish all my life. So there's so much we could
Awesome.
talk about. And I'm just glad you guys are able to come on here with me.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, truly, truly.
And I just hope we could have another conversation soon. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in. I put a little poll if you're up for seeing them return. As always,
Awesome.
all power to all the people.
Awesome. Thank
Peace.
you.